When people think of organised crime, they tend to think of something chaotic. They think of the gangs of Chicago, maybe the mafia, a certain amount of order kept in place by violence. But one of the interesting things about Berlin in the 1920s is that crime had real structure. The Ringvereine, named after the signet rings they wore to identify themselves, were associations linked to the criminal underworld, especially in Berlin. They had grown out of organizations in the late 19th century that had been put together to enable prisoners who had supposedly been rehabilitated to re enter society. They were mutual support networks. And outwardly, they presented themselves as clubs or associations to do just that. In practice, however, they were an environment to create connections, to establish loyalty, to farm out jobs, to put you in contact with a fence or specialist for whatever operation you had going on. They offered protection, they offered solidarity, and a kind of shadow order around people already in a criminal life. It was a peculiarly German approach to criminality. And the way that the Ringvereine worked matters because modern cities don't just produce crime through desperation, they also produce systems. They produce networks of middlemen, favors, safe spaces, enforcers, information exchange, rules that are unofficial perhaps, but nevertheless very real. And the Ringverein were ideally suited to optimize this. Once these systems existed, the boundary between what was respectable and what was the underworld wasn't as clean as it might otherwise have been. And you see this in any environment with a high level of organized crime, whether it's the Yakuza in Japan, the Tongs in certain cities in China, the mafia in Italy, and the mob in the United States. And exactly the same occurred in Berlin. And that, in many ways, makes Berlin an incredibly modern city in that it had institutionalized even criminality and given it order. Crime had always existed, but it had been piecemeal, it had been haphazard. The Ringverein made it into a structured entity.